In 1994, Linda, a 24-year-old university student, was planning a round-the-world trip as she neared the end of her studies. She decided to take a break with her sister at the Coogee Bay Hotel's pub in the suburbs of Sydney, unaware of the nightmare that awaited her. The evening went fairly well, except for one incident. A man approached her sister and attempted to strike up a conversation, harassed her. The girl politely but firmly declined his advances. A little later, when Linda left the pub, it was a beautiful night outside, and she decided to take a walk along the coastal path to enjoy the view. The desire to walk suddenly struck her, and all she had to do was walk 200 meters. But that's when he attacked. Out of the corner of her eye, Linda noticed movement, and almost instinctively, she realized what was about to happen because the man was creeping, wearing a balaclava. She realized that she was about to be attacked, but still didn't know how it would end, whether she would survive. The man had only seconds to approach her, closing in and brandishing a knife at her face, saying, "You will do as I say." The young woman realized that her sole task was to survive the attack because she feared he might use the knife. Additionally, she recognized him as the same man who had approached her sister at the pub. Linda replied, "Okay, I'll do whatever you say." The man instructed the girl to sit down. He continued holding the knife to her face, and Linda tried to distract him. She began asking questions, such as whether he was following her, a series of inquiries aimed at buying some time and figuring out how to escape the situation. However, this only seemed to infuriate him. Suddenly, she grasped that she had reached a point where her only option was to survive this night by any possible means. Even after 29 years, it was still painful for Linda to recall what happened next. It was horrifying. When the man was finished, the young woman was even more terrified because she didn't know if he would spare her. The assailant ordered her to move back to the path she had been walking on. There was an old brick wall and a precipice there, and she was already saying her goodbyes, fearing he would push her off the cliff to prevent her from identifying him. This was her greatest fear, so she desperately clung to the wall, but the stranger stepped back slightly and said, "Now you can go." He added, "Thank you." She ran as fast as she could. As she ran in terror, she had no idea that she was fleeing from a serial rapist, and his chilling words spoken in parting would become the signature of the monster known as the Bondi Beast. Linda ran to the nearest hotel and called the police to report the assault. The following hours only compounded her stress. She was traumatized, in pain, exhausted, and unable to sleep all night. However, she had to provide preliminary statements and allow specialists to conduct various tests. Afterward, she accompanied the detectives to the scene of the crime. It was already 10 in the morning. Linda longed for simple comforts like clean clothes, but she had to remain in a hospital gown and barefoot. During these several hours after the assault, the young woman felt humiliated, but believed that the evidence collected would one day lead to the capture of her attacker. A series of horrifying attacks on women in the vicinity of Sydney evolved into one of Australia's most convoluted unsolved cases. From the mid-1980s until 2001, the Beast of Bondi targeted at least 31 victims. He was highly intelligent, exceedingly cunning, and agile enough to elude capture for his crimes. The police lacked leads, but to their credit, they never ceased their investigation. Thanks to outstanding police work and advances in DNA analysis, 37 years after he first struck, detectives finally unmasked the predator. The way they accomplished this is simply incredible. Like Linda, Jennifer knows what it means to bear this burden. These two women have never met and live hundreds of kilometers apart, but they are united by something truly horrific. The beast from Bondi attacked them both. In the distant year of 1987, Jennifer was 32 years old. On the night of September 26th to 27th, she was sleeping in her modest apartment in Randwick, one of those places where Prince of Wales hospital employees could enjoy a few hours of rest between shifts. Her nurse's uniform hung on the door, already prepared for the early morning. At 5 in the morning, shortly before Jennifer needed to wake up, she experienced the worst nightmare of any woman. A man in a balaclava woke her up. He held a knife to her throat and declared that he had come to violate her. "Don't make a sound," he told her, "or I'll make it hurt." Jennifer, still half asleep, tried to defend herself, telling him, "Look, my uniform is hanging over there. I'm getting ready for work, and they will come for me soon. You need to hurry and put the knife down." She was afraid that he would use the knife on her because he was behaving very aggressively. Indeed, he put the knife down and undressed. The stranger even removed his balaclava, and Jennifer saw his face. He stayed in the room, probably not more than 10 minutes. During all this time, Jennifer focused on a streetlight whose light penetrated through the balcony. Perhaps it was through this light that the stranger entered her room. To this day, something as mundane as the flickering of a light is enough to trigger horrifying memories in her. He must have been stalking her because there were men in all the neighboring apartments. Jennifer was terrified. She admits that she had a chance to grab the knife and strike him, but she's not the kind of person who can harm another human being. As if the pain from the assault wasn't enough, the stranger decided to humiliate Jennifer further. As he left, he said, "I love you." She admits that after that, she felt dirty and repulsive. These terrible events of those 10 minutes led to decades of emotional breakdowns. Before this, Jennifer was very cheerful, sociable, and open. Her happy outlook on life was stolen from her in the pre-dawn hours of September 27, 1987. Immediately after the assault, Jennifer went to the police. She was very uncomfortable, but the forensic evidence she provided at the time helped the police uncover the man in the balaclava. The scale of his attacks was incredible. He targeted victims among random girls along the famous coastal track from Bondi to Coogee, in parks, including Centennial Park, and even in a cemetery at any time of day or night. In other cases, women were attacked while sleeping in their homes. The perpetrator must have considered himself invulnerable. What's remarkable is that he didn't become cautious over time. It was as if he was confident from the very beginning. He was also cunning, evading the police for years. His attacks stretched across various eastern suburbs of Sydney, and at that time, the police were puzzled, believing they were looking for different individuals. Even newspaper headlines pointed to several criminals: the Centennial Park rapist, the sports costume rapist, and the Bondi rapist. The victims provided a similar description of the attacker. He was a dark-skinned man with brown eyes and a broad nose, standing between 160 to 180 centimeters tall. In the early stages of his criminal career, he was described as slender, but later he transformed into a strong and muscular man. He concealed his face with a ski mask and wore comfortable everyday clothing, such as sweatshirts, shorts, and sports suits. He either brandished a knife in front of the girls or convinced them that he had one. His victims included women, girls, and even children aged from 13 to 55 years old. This is quite unusual, as most criminals tend to focus on a specific age group. This suggests his desire to seize any opportunity and attack any available girl rather than targeting a specific appearance. Because the perpetrator operated in different suburbs of Sydney, his appearance changed as he aged, and his victims had little in common with each other. The police believed for many years that they were looking for different criminals. However, detectives noticed remarkable similarities among all the cases reported by women: the knife, the balaclava, and, most importantly, the words he spoke before leaving. It wasn't until 2005 that officers began to grasp the full extent of this case. While the police assured that each case of violence was thoroughly investigated, it was only now, thanks to advancements in DNA analysis, that they managed to connect 5 attacks from the year 2000. Realizing they were dealing with a serial offender, the police formed a special team called Strike Force Doreen to investigate his crimes. After a breakthrough, they understood that their suspect had assaulted at least 31 women. They linked 12 attacks directly through DNA analysis, and another 19 through the distinctive characteristics of the crimes and the perpetrator's modus operandi. His modus operandi was so distinct that they were confident it couldn't be another assailant committing crimes in a similar manner. Working on this case, the team of detectives realized that the last attack by the Bondi Beast had occurred in 2001. By that time, it had been ongoing for 16 years, with 30 women as victims. At 1:30 in the morning, a woman was walking through the Waverley Cemetery, perched on the cliffs in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. It's an astonishingly beautiful yet eerie place. Suddenly, someone attacked her from behind. A man wearing a balaclava and armed with a knife. He brutally assaulted her before fleeing. No one stopped him, no one scared him off. And to this day, it remains unknown why he stopped after that attack. Some theories by investigators suggested that he, for some reason, became incapacitated, got injured, or moved to another country. But unlike the perpetrator, the police didn't stop their pursuit. Their persistence paid off in 2016. The police got incredibly lucky. They found a distant relative of the suspect whose DNA matched the DNA samples from the victims' bodies. Australian experts used the same methods that helped identify the famous American serial killer, Joseph DeAngelo. When the police searched for a DNA match, they can find a match not with the DNA of the suspect himself, but with that of a relative who is also in the police database. Unexpectedly, such a person was found in the database. Using this information, experts began reconstructing the suspect's family tree. On this tree, they found 4 DNA matches. These 4 DNA markers followed 4 different branches of the family tree, reducing the number of potential suspects to 324 individuals. The tree included 5 generations of the family, going back to the 1800s. By eliminating those who had long since died or didn't match in terms of age or location, they narrowed it down to 120 individuals. This allowed them to pinpoint one family branch on which the investigators could focus. In other words, after science reduced the number of potential suspects, it was time for old-fashioned police work. Officers reviewed thousands of documents and old police reports when creating a psychological profile of the perpetrator. They ruled out those who were significantly older or younger than the suspect, didn't match the physical description or build. The meticulous process of elimination took several years, but in the end, only one suspect remained. To prove their case, the police needed to obtain his DNA. They used an order to obtain a sample from the man's medical records and conducted the analysis. The DNA samples from the suspect and the rapist matched. It was a moment of triumph. The case was finally solved. For many years, the Australian media described brutal attacks that occurred in the eastern suburbs of Sydney and gave nicknames to the terrible individuals who terrorized the area. The park rapist, the sports costume rapist, and the Bondi rapist. Only Keith Sims knew that all these nicknames referred to him, along with the horrific crimes associated with them. To his friends and family, he was Magoo, a faithful husband, father, and grandfather. Keith Sims lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called La Perouse and was a model family man. He and his wife spent 43 years in a happy marriage, during which they had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. It all came to an end when Keith Sims passed away in 2022 at the age of 66 due to kidney disease, surrounded by loved ones. At his funeral at the Catholic Church of St. Andrew in Malabar, a suburb in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, on March 4th, he was described as a kind-hearted hero and an example to follow, someone who loved playing football, attending parties, and supporting the Australian professional rugby team. Several months after his death, this description would be turned upside down, cast into doubt, when the police directly linked Keith Sims' DNA to samples taken from 12 victims of violence. Despite detectives being 7 months late and unable to arrest the suspect, it did not relieve them of their unpleasant duties. They had to tell the Sims family, who were grieving for a husband, father, and grandfather, that he was not the person they believed him to be. Keith had deceived everyone. They had no idea, and nothing in his life indicated the possibility that he could be a criminal. Over the years, he had held various jobs, including working for the National Parks and Wildlife Service of Australia, a golf club, and the University of New South Wales. The media tried to obtain comments from Keith's employers, and the university informed them that they had hired him as a gardener in 2017, 6 years after his first known attack. Perhaps such work, requiring him to spend a lot of time outdoors, allowed him to attack random pedestrians at any time without arousing suspicion from colleagues or employers. Several weeks after the breakthrough and the case being exposed, detectives reached out to Jennifer, Linda, and other victims of Keith Sims and uttered the words they had been waiting for half their lives. "We found him." Many of the women they called felt relief, knowing that he could never inflict something similar on anyone else. Jennifer had been waiting for this news for 35 years, and upon hearing it, she burst into tears. She was glad that she wouldn't have to testify in court, and hoped that his departure from this life was not painless because he deserved it. Like Jennifer, Linda had spent decades wondering if the police would ever catch the predator who had tormented her. But when the detectives unexpectedly called her in October 2022, she felt that she might finally get some answers. She was at work when she received a message from the detective on her phone. The detective simply told Linda that they had identified him. Linda initially thought that he would finally be convicted and felt crushed upon learning that it would never happen. Then, half an hour later, after reflecting on it, she felt relief because she wouldn't have to go to court. Although the incredible breakthrough brought some peace to the victims and satisfaction to the detectives, Keith Sims' death left many unanswered questions. For example, How did a man who was a father of 3 and had been in a 43-year-long marriage manage to keep his second life a secret for so long? Linda says she genuinely sympathizes with Sims's family, but she is determined to do everything in her power to make him pay for the pain he inflicted on her and dozens of other women. While there won't be a trial, Linda doesn't believe that he got away with it, because here it is, his legacy. He will only be remembered as a rapist. He lived 2 lives, being a normal person to some but terrorizing others and showing no remorse for his actions. The police cannot say for sure if there are more unidentified victims, but they believe there are many, as women often do not want to come forward, relive the violence, subject themselves to interrogations, and so on. Linda understands their reluctance, but also understands the importance of it, as it could lead to the case being solved and a dangerous serial offender who has terrorized the city for decades being captured. Linda and Jennifer are 2 victims of the rapist who were directly connected to Keith Sims through DNA. When the police asked them to provide samples of the perpetrator's biological fluids, they felt terrible because, as Jennifer recalls, they had been thoroughly examined by forensic experts, collecting all possible evidence. However, their courage and the DNA materials they provided became the key to identifying this predator. They provided the most critical clue to solving the case and determining the identity of one of Australia's most elusive serial rapists, Keith Sims. Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not 1, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Tricia had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Tricia Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Tricia and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Tricia's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Tricia's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Tricia had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Tricia's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Tricia's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Tricia a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Tricia's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Tricia's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner, and later he bought Trisha's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Trisha's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Trisha. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Trisha's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Trisha's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Trisha's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer. But when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities. But upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft. And it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten. But by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children, aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Tricia Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Tricia's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Tricia's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Tricia's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Tricia's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Tricia was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Tricia's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Tricia's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Tricia's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Tricia's murder. This was the news the Pacaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Tricia, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Tricia Pacaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night, but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims.
Musketeer, Indian, Marquise, and Piero, dressed up in masquerade costumes, 4 girls set off for the carnival. For Peggy and Amelie, it's unthinkable to miss the famous Shrove Tuesday masquerade, especially since they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey this year. The girls spent the entire second half of the day getting ready. Finally, the preparations are complete, and their mother takes a picture of her smiling daughters in anticipation. Could she imagine that the festive evening could turn into a drama? Could anyone imagine that the girls would fall into the hands of strangers, whose cruelty France would soon dub them as the Siamese brothers of horror? On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, La Portelle, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amelie, had never missed it. Today they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amelie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to La Portelle. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabel. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amelie into Piero, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabel turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabel. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Partel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amelie wanted to show Audrey and Isabel. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Equihen, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amelie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Partel and Equihen. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amelie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-José Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabel and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabel and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. As time went on, and when the 2 mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie-José Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabel and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Loa. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabel, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and knocked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamotte family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Equihen, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girl's disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassonville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now, they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dune. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder, and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabel became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amelie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Pierrot, and agreed to give them a ride to Cayenne. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cécile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of an earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could two brothers lead four girls against their will over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark, and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in Saint Amand. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Bursurma. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of Saint Cecile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the blackthorn, and you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabelle realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amelie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held on to each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple, you just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michelle and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of Saint Cecile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home. For 17 years, even the youngest residents of the French commune of Germain couldn't truly enjoy life due to the pervasive fear that gripped their families. Local resident Manon lives near the former home of the grieving family, and her parents told her about what happened when she was still a child. We walk the same streets, so, of course, we are afraid that someone might attack or abduct us, the girl says. My father always accompanied me, and now we finally know what he did, and he confessed to everything. That is somewhat comforting. For 17 whole years, it was impossible to see a child walking alone on the street. On January 9, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin disappeared while returning home from school in her hometown of Germain, in the department of Seine-et-Marne near Paris. The girl lived with her mother Suzanne Mouzin, who was in the process of divorcing her husband and Estelle's father, Eric Mouzin. The father lived in the commune of Le Vessinet with her older brother Arthur, approximately 60 kilometers away from her mother's home. When Suzanne returned home from work at 7:30 p.m. and realized that her daughter was not there, she reported the child's disappearance to the police. In July 2003, the police began to suspect that serial killer Michel Fourniret might be involved in Estelle's disappearance because he had confessed to killing 7 people, including 3 young girls. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier appeared to be ordinary French retirees, he with his glasses and well-groomed hands in a professorial pose, and she, with her sunken cheeks, resembled a typical grandmother looking after her grandchildren. Behind this facade, however, lay one of France's most dangerous sexual predators, who committed his murders with the active involvement of his wife and faithful accomplice. This grey-haired couple stood alongside the most horrifying criminals in the country's history. Using her image as a happily married respectable wife, Olivier instilled confidence in the girls that they had nothing to fear, while the poor victims were about to become the next prey of the killers. Once the girls were kidnapped, bound and sometimes drugged, Olivier would inspect them, checking whether they were virgins, which her husband desired. The couple met after Fourniret was arrested in 1984 for sexual crimes in the Paris area, and placed an advertisement in a newspaper seeking a pen pal. Michel and Monique corresponded for a long time, and then, as it turned out, Fourniret proposed to Olivier, a former caregiver, to get rid of her 2 ex-husbands who, according to Monique, had mistreated her. In exchange, she promised to find young girls for him. Fourniret never fulfilled his promise, but 2 months after his release in 1987, Olivier did what she called her first offering to her beast. Isabelle Laville was a shy 17-year-old girl who was seeing a therapist. Olivier said she chose her because she reminded her of her young self but was still an innocent girl that her husband desired. Olivier drove up to Isabelle in her car and asked for directions, convincing the girl to get in the car and show her the way. A little further down the road, Fourniret was waiting for them, pretending to be a motorist who needed help because his car broke down. Olivier stopped and allowed the man to get in. As they continued on their way, Fourniret, sitting in the back seat, strangled the girl and announced that she was now their captive. On the way back to their home, they drugged Isabelle too much. At home, Fourniret found himself unable to assault the girl, so he had sex with Monique instead, and then he killed Isabelle by strangling her. In 2006, he led the police to her remains, which were dumped in an old well. Olivier claimed she didn't know that Fourniret would kill the girl. Whatever the case, the incident seemed to solidify the relationship between the couple. In 1988, while pregnant, Olivier asked 20-year-old student Fabienne Leroy for help, saying she urgently needed to see a doctor. The sympathetic girl got into the car, and this time, Fourniret was behind the wheel. He drove the car into a field and forced the victim to get out at gunpoint. After Olivier checked the girl's virginity, Fourniret assaulted and killed Fabienne. Her body was found in a field the next day, and the couple continued to find victims and kill them following their established pattern. When their son Salim was born, the criminals didn't hesitate to use him as bait, telling girls they needed a doctor for the baby. Even if Olivier didn't always accompany her husband on his trips, he would always tell her about his exploits, claiming that he went hunting or saying, "I found satisfaction." In 2003, Fourniret made a mistake. A 13-year-old girl he abducted in Belgium managed to escape from his van when he stopped at a gas station. She chewed through the rope he used to tie her wrists. The girl was picked up by a passing motorist, who noted down the van's license plate number. Fourniret was arrested, and in his car, they found several hairs, one of which belonged to Manania Thumpong, a 13-year-old girl whose remains were found in a forest in 2001. Fourniret was not eager to cooperate with the investigation, but the police from at least 5 countries, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, began reviewing cases of violence, abductions, and murders that remained unsolved, and resembled Fourniret's crimes. In Denmark, the police noticed that the composite sketch of a suspect in a violent crime closely resembled Fourniret, while in the Netherlands, Fourniret started to be suspected in the disappearance of 2 girls. In 2004, the criminal finally confessed to kidnapping and killing victims during the 1980s and 1990s, admitting to abducting 9 girls and young women during that time. He is also suspected of 10 more murders, 9 in France and 1 in Belgium. In 2006, rumors circulated that Fourniret might be the true culprit in the case of Christian Ranucci. Christian, a 20-year-old man, was beheaded by the guillotine in France on July 28, 1976, after being suspected of killing 8-year-old Marie Dolores Rambler. This case had always been highly controversial. On June 3, 1974, Marie Dolores and her brother Jean met a young man driving a car, wearing a red sweater, who claimed he was looking for his lost dog. The man asked the children to help him, and Jean ran to search for the dog, while Marie Dolores got into the man's car and was abducted. An hour after the girl's disappearance, Christian's car, a grey Peugeot 304, was involved in an accident and left the scene. Witnesses described the driver's appearance to the police, who immediately concluded a connection between the abduction and the fleeing motorist. After a search, Marie Dolores' body was found in the bushes, where she had been strangled to death. Ranucci was arrested due to the car accident and the fact that he was allegedly carrying a heavy package. Police found trousers with dried blood stains in his car, and the blood group on the trousers matched the girl's blood group. At first, Ranucci confessed to the murder and told the police where he had hidden the knife, in the bushes. What was strange about this confession was that he only confessed to facts that the police had already established in the first 48 hours of the investigation. A day later, Ranucci denied his involvement in the crime. Allegedly, Ranucci's case was adjusted, and physical evidence was hidden to match his confession. The bloodstains on the trousers turned out to be much older and were merely the result of the man falling off a motorcycle. Moreover, Ranucci had the same blood group as the girl. An elderly couple who witnessed the incident claimed to have seen the girl on the backseat of Ranucci's car and heard her screaming. However, the credibility of this statement is questionable since the couple did not leave their own car, and the door of Ranucci's car was broken from the side opposite to where the pensioners claimed he had taken the girl out. Later, 5 more people claimed to have witnessed the abduction, and all of them described a man who looked nothing like Ranucci. 2 interesting points are worth noting. Firstly, Fourniret also drove a grey Peugeot 304, which from behind resembled a Simca 1100, a car described by 2 witnesses as the one the driver used to lure children inside on the day of Marie Dolores' abduction. The driver was wearing a red sweater, which was later found by investigators. As it turned out, the sweater found at the crime scene did not belong to Ranucci, as several sizes too small for an athletic-looking young man like him. Secondly, the most surprising discovery was a photograph taken by a photographer from a Marseille newspaper in March 1976 in the courtroom during Ranucci's trial. Among the visitors, there sat a man with glasses who suspiciously resembled Fourniret. Although the fact that Fourniret attended the trial was refuted, it is hard to deny that he is a much more suitable suspect in this case. For example, he went on vacation to Marseille in June 1974, driving a car of the same grey color and brand. At that time, he was 32 years old and, compared to Ranucci, already had a history of sexual crimes. Fourniret also frequently used the lost dog trick to lure young girls into his car. Additionally, no signs of violence were found on the child's body. Unfortunately for Ranucci, the media frenzy around the girl's murder made him a suspect even before the case went to trial. Immediately after his arrest, the press labeled him as the killer, and he was sentenced to death, becoming one of the last people executed in France. Why did the police begin to suspect that Michel Fourniret might be connected to the disappearance of Estelle Mouzin? 2 weeks before Estelle's disappearance, a 9-year-old girl was almost kidnapped by a man in a white van. The girl was able to describe the driver to the police, which led to the creation of a composite sketch of the suspect. When the police focused their efforts on Fourniret, who also drove a white van, they showed the girl a photo of him, hoping she would recognize him, but she didn't. Additionally, after his confession to the murders, Fourniret led the police to the burial site of one of his young victims. On the way there, he described the clothing the girl was wearing on the day of her abduction, which was similar to what Estelle was wearing on the day she disappeared, although the police believe this might be a mere coincidence. Sometime later, the police found photos of Estelle and recordings of television programs about the girl in Fourniret's house and on his computer. It's worth noting that 2 fragments of white shoelaces and black gloves were found with Fourniret, and Estelle was wearing white shoes and black gloves on the day of her disappearance. However, the police couldn't find any additional connections between the serial killer and the crime, and the hypothesis of Fourniret's involvement had to be discarded due to a lack of evidence. Moreover, he had an alibi. He claimed he made a phone call to his son from his home on the day the girl disappeared. Although there was no certainty that Fourniret actually made that call, the police believed he was not lying. Psychologists were also confident that Fourniret was not involved in the case because Estelle was too young for him. The 3 girls he confessed to murdering were 12 and 13 years old. His accomplice and wife, Monique Olivier, told the police that once when they were watching a TV program accusing Fourniret of killing Estelle, he laughed and said it wasn't him. In May 2010, the Mouzin family's lawyer requested a new investigation into Fourniret's involvement. In 2013, he was declared innocent after several hair analyses from his van, conducted when he was arrested in 2003, did not match Estelle's DNA. As for the second suspect in Estelle Muzin's kidnapping, Nordal Leland Days, the police were interested in him in connection with 3 different crimes. He was the main suspect in the murder of Arthur Noyer, a soldier who disappeared in April, and whose skull was found in September. He was also the main suspect in the case of the disappearance of Melis do Araujo, a 9-year-old girl who was kidnapped from a wedding on August 27, 2017. 9-year-old Melis do Araujo was last seen on the night of August 27, 2017, at a wedding to which she was invited with her parents. At the event, the children were playing separately from the adult celebration. Around 3 a.m., her absence was noticed, and her search began initially without police involvement. A witness at the wedding recalled, the DJ of the evening announced over the microphone that a child was missing. Suddenly everyone started searching in the main hall and outside. It was terrible. To witness the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl, it's very serious. At first, we thought she fell asleep somewhere after playing hide and seek. An hour later, when she wasn't found, the police were called. The arriving police initiated the search for the child using search dogs and also explored the area with helicopters. All 180 guests invited to the wedding were interviewed. Almost immediately, investigators noticed inconsistencies in the statements of Nordal Leland Days, a friend of the groom. A week into the investigation, after crime scene analysts found DNA belonging to the girl on the dashboard of Leland Days' car, he was charged with her kidnapping. From that moment, Leland Days remained silent, refusing to assist the investigation, and claimed that even though the girl might have been in his car, it didn't prove his guilt. As the police conducted their investigation into the child's disappearance, they discovered other clues pointing to Leland Days' involvement. In particular, a surveillance camera captured a car belonging to the man leaving the wedding venue with a small figure on the passenger seat shortly before the girl's disappearance was reported. The blurry silhouette was wearing a white dress, similar to what Melis was wearing. The parents recognized elements of the dress, especially the child's ribbon, said their lawyer, Fabian Rajon. Additionally, Leland Days' phone was in airplane mode around the time of the girl's disappearance, and it turned back on 39 minutes later, when he returned to the celebration alone. It was also established that the next day, Leland Days spent several hours cleaning his car with powerful cleaning products. He claimed he did it to prepare the car for sale. Leland Days' defense initially disputed the timeline provided by the prosecution. His lawyer confirmed that while traces of the girl's DNA were found on his car's dashboard, his client completely denied kidnapping her. He stated that several DNA traces were found on the dashboard, and someone who had contact with the child could have transferred her DNA into the car. He also speculated that children could have gotten into the car without the driver's knowledge, noting that the windows were open during the celebration. After 6 months of investigation, Leland Days was forced to change his statements when Melis' blood was found in the trunk of his car. He confessed to killing the girl and apologized to her parents. Earlier, he had admitted that she was in his car on the night of her disappearance but claimed not to know anything about her subsequent fate. Now, he admitted that he unintentionally killed the child. The prosecutor from Grenoble, Jean-Yves Coquelet, stated that Leland Days led investigators to the location near his parents' home in Domessine, Savoie Department, where the body was found. The search for the remains of the young girl took an entire day and was complicated by snow and rough terrain. Some of the girl's remains were found by the investigators and search dogs. The prosecutor from Grenoble said that Melis' parents are no longer in the dark, adding that they know their daughter is dead, that she was killed, and that a few minutes ago, they were told that the child's remains were found. This is a horrific conclusion to the case, the culmination of 6 months of investigation and search, he added. The girl's mother addressed Leland Days through a Facebook message. "We had to wait 5.5 months for this monster to finally speak. Melis will haunt you day and night in your cell," she wrote, grieving. "My little angel, I couldn't protect you from this predator, and I will blame myself for that for a long time." Nordal Leland Days, a former military dog handler who was also charged with the murder of a young soldier, claims that he killed Melis do Araujo by mistake but refused to provide details of what happened. Post-mortem examination showed that the girl had a broken jaw, likely from a strong blow to the face. The prosecutors handling Melis' case suspect Lelandais to be a serial killer. On December 21, 2017, he was charged with the murder of Arthur Noyer, a 23-year-old soldier who disappeared without a trace during a hike on April 12, 2017. The soldier's relatives admitted that they also hoped to learn the truth about his death. Arthur was last seen early in the morning on April 12, 2017, as he left a nightclub to go on a hike in Chambéry. Pieces of his skull were found on a hiking trail in the municipality of Montmelian, near Chambéry, in September. The phone company recorded Lelandais' phone in the same area at the time of the soldier's disappearance. Lelandais' Audi A3 was also spotted by surveillance cameras in the Chambéry area. During the investigation, police also searched his computer and phone, and it was revealed that 2 weeks after the soldier's disappearance, Lelandais entered the search query human body dismemberment. Over time, Lelandais confessed to investigators that he gave the soldier a ride but denied any involvement in his death before finally admitting to the murder on March 29, 2018. There are also suspicions that Lelandais may be responsible for the unsolved murder of 3 people in the Alps when a British man, his wife, and his mother-in-law were killed in a car park in a wooded area in September 2012. Other cases in which Lelandais may be involved include the disappearance of Adrien Murel, a 24-year-old Belgian man who went missing near Lake Annecy in July, and Jean-Christophe Morin and Ahmed Hamad, who disappeared in 2011 and 2012, respectively. Lelandais' alleged connections to these murders led the police to start reviewing other cases of missing people in the region as they feared he might be a serial killer. The police investigated his possible involvement in at least 10 other crimes. While investigating other potential crimes, Lelandais' connection to the case of Estelle Mouzin came to light. Melis' disappearance bore similarities to Estelle's case, as the girls were about the same age, and both vanished without a trace, with no witnesses to the abductions. Recognizing this similarity, Estelle's family requested to determine Lelandais' whereabouts at the time of their daughter's disappearance. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it turned out that he was serving in the military in the Marne department, 150 kilometers away from where Estelle disappeared. Thus, law enforcement had to dismiss him as a second prospective suspect in Estelle Mouzin's abduction case. Over the course of several years while the search for Estelle was ongoing, other potential leads were discovered, which ultimately led nowhere. For instance, a real shock for the girl's family was the appearance of a photo allegedly of Estelle, which was taken from a website containing indecent images of children. Her father confessed how upset he was by the appearance of such a photo, but it turned out not to be his daughter. The girl in the photo appeared older than Estelle, and the image was taken several years before her disappearance. The police had no new leads, and the chances of finding Estelle were diminishing before their eyes. But then thunder struck on January 24, 2020, when Monique Olivier, the former wife of Michel Fourniret, claimed that her ex-husband killed Estelle Mouzin. On March 6, 2020, her statements were confirmed by Michel Fourniret himself. For years, Michel Fourniret denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance. However, 16.5 years later, on November 27, 2019, Michel Fourniret, a serial killer and predator of minors who was already serving a life sentence, became the primary suspect once again. He was charged with abduction and forced confinement, which ended in death. On January 24, 2020, Monique Olivier confirmed to Judge Sabine Keris that it was indeed her who made the phone call from their home to Fourniret's son on January 9, 2003, the day of the girl's disappearance. Not stopping there, she continued to narrate that the girl represented the type of victim her husband was seeking, and she was not too young for him as psychologists once claimed. She admitted that a few days before the abduction, her husband had been driving around the region and returned one evening, announcing that he had spotted a beautiful little target, as he put it. Responding to questions from the investigating judge after his alibi collapsed due to his former wife's confession, Fourniret finally confirmed that he abducted and killed the girl. However, the elderly Fourniret claimed during the hearing that he suffers from memory loss and was not formally charged. "It is very likely, even very, very likely, that I was the author of that disappearance," Fourniret said, asserting that nothing clicked in his head when he was shown a picture of the girl. "Since I cannot say for sure that I am responsible for her disappearance, I call on you to consider me as guilty," he added. Fourniret, 78 years old according to media reports, is suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, experiencing moments of absence, but is generally understood everything, according to Didier Sabin, the lawyer of Estelle's father. To corroborate Fourniret's statements, Monique Olivier was questioned again, and she confirmed that her husband did indeed abduct and kill Estelle Mouzin. Although Fourniret confessed to the girl's murder, he refused or was unable to reveal the location where he hid her body. He only mentioned that she might be on the property of one of his houses in the Ardennes. Forensics began the grim search for the girl's remains on Monday, June 22, 2020. Experts sealed off Fourniret's former home in northern France, more than 200 kilometers from where Estelle was abducted on her way home from school. The police also cordoned off another former residence of Fourniret in Château de Sautou, where the remains of other victims of the killer, a 12-year-old girl and a 22-year-old woman, were found in 2004. Unfortunately, they did not find Estelle's body. "We can report some progress, but some doors have been closed forever, places we can now discard," said one of the lawyers representing the Mouzin family. Even before Fourniret's confession to Estelle's murder, the serial killer, nicknamed the Monster of the Ardennes, as well as the Virginity Hunter, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His accomplice, Monique Olivier, also received a life sentence with the possibility of parole only after 28 years. On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable, and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, and made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous. And he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, Anne thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, big, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control. And her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl, whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, bound and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown. But it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had. So she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, After serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful blonde, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with 1 past murder, 1 attempted murder, and at least 1 future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3. Not knowing what to do with them, he sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe, while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Baymer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police had their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence. He knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night in Vienna" depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter, as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly 2 women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Swinney is too dangerous to ever be released again.